Edmonton. I'm a first-year master's student at the University of Ottawa, and today's presentation will be about whether an additive model of initiation could potentially explain intersensory facilitation. Now, before getting into intersensory facilitation and what it entails, it is important to understand basic concepts regarding reaction time. So let's begin by defining what reaction time is. Reaction time can be defined as the time interval between the presentation of a stimulus and the beginning of a response. So you can think of a sprinter that's at the start line, waiting for the sound of the gun to go off so he can begin his movement. So the time interval between the sound of the gun and the beginning of his movement would be his reaction time. Now, generally speaking, we are faster to react to an auditory stimulus than we are to a visual stimulus, and there are reasons for this. The first reason being that the pathway traveling from your ears to your auditory cortex is shorter than the pathway traveling from your eyes to your occipital lobe. And also, visual information is a lot more complex and requires more processing, so the more processing, the longer the reaction time. Now, although our reaction time to an auditory stimulus is normally faster than that of a visual, interestingly enough, if the visual stimulus is closely followed by an auditory stimulus, then reaction time is faster than either stimulus alone produces. And this is what we call intersensory facilitation. Now, there have been many attempts to explain this effect, and today we're going to touch on three models in particular that provide us with different explanations for this phenomenon. So let's go ahead and begin with the horse race model. Now, according to the horse race model, you've got two different stimuli, say a visual and auditory stimulus, that are basically racing against each other to get to the finish line. And whichever stimulus gets there first will be the winner, right? So in other words, whichever stimulus you detect first will be your observed reaction time latency. Now, I'll give you a visual of what I'm talking about if this thing doesn't crash. There we go. Now over here, on the x-axis, we've got the time, and on the y-axis, we've got the activation up to a certain threshold, which is basically this dashed line over here. Now, as you can see, there's a green square that represents the visual stimulus, and a horn over here that represents the auditory stimulus. Now, if these two stimuli were racing against each other to the finish line, which of them would win? Well, to answer this question, we need to isolate both stimuli and understand how they're processed individually. So let's begin with the auditory stimulus. What we know about this stimulus in particular is that it takes about 25 milliseconds for the signal to travel from your brain to your muscle in your arm, right? We also know that it takes about 35 milliseconds to process auditory information or to detect a tone. And we also know that your average reaction time to an auditory stimulus is about 125 milliseconds. So what's really left is this shaded area over here, which is where we think the initiation process is taking place. Now, since we've got these two coordinates, we can solve for the slope and determine how long it would take us to get through the initiation process, which is about 65 milliseconds. Now, if we look at the visual stimulus, we also know that it takes the signal 25 milliseconds to travel from your brain to your muscle. And we also know that your average reaction time to a visual stimulus is about 215 milliseconds. And now if we use the same slope that we used over here, we'd also determine or predict that the initiation process would take about 65 milliseconds. So this coordinate over here allows us to know where the initiation process would begin. And what's really left right now is the 125 milliseconds that we need to process visual information. Okay, I know that was a lot, but basically if these two stimuli were racing against each other to the finish line, the auditory stimulus would win because it'd be detected way before the visual. Makes sense? So, although this horse race model is interesting, it doesn't predict the fast reaction times that we find in conditions where both stimuli are presented at similar times. So this is where a statistical facilitation model comes into play. And this model is also a horse race model, but it's different in that now we've got two different distributions, right? So the red distribution is the auditory reaction time distribution, and the blue distribution is the visual reaction time distribution. Now, as you can see, our reaction time to both stimuli can vary, right? Sometimes it can be faster, sometimes it can be slower, but you don't know which of these reaction times over here are going to be competing with which of these reaction times over here. So is it this one against this one against this one? We don't know, right? But in general, if you were to close your eyes and draw from both distributions 1,000 times, the probability that you would get a faster visual reaction time in comparison to auditory is so small that the mean of your condition should look something like this. Now, if you look closely, this mean is not very different than the mean of the auditory reaction time distribution, right? Well, let's look at what happens when you've got a bigger overlap. Now, if you were to kind of close your eyes and draw from either distributions, the probability that you would get a visual reaction time that is faster than auditory gets bigger. So what happens to your mean? It gets smaller, right? Now you've got a bigger chance of getting faster reaction times. And now basically here you've got a bigger overlap, which means you've got an even higher probability of getting faster reaction times, and now your mean gets even shorter, right? And of course over here we've got a complete overlap of both distributions, which means that the probability that you would get really fast reaction times is extremely high, which means that your mean should look something like this. And again, the mean is significantly smaller than the first one. Now this equation here is a little overwhelming, you don't have to understand it, but all you gotta know is that we use this equation to predict reaction times according to the amount of overlap that we have. Now although this model seems compelling as well, it still cannot explain or predict the fast reaction times that we find in experiments such as this one. So this is where this model kind of helps us out and solves the puzzle. And it's known as the co-activation model. Now according to this model, the different processes that are involved in the reaction time interval could be enhanced with the presentation of multiple stimuli. So unlike the horse race and statistical facilitation models that propose two separate streams of activation, the co-activation model proposes that you've got different signals that are contributing to a common pool of activation. I'll explain what I mean. Now imagine you've got this empty cup of water over here, and you get to open this tap, but I only give you 10 seconds to fill up the cup. Where would the water be after 10 seconds? Well, it'll be about here. But let's say I empty the cup again, and I tell you this time you can open 2 taps. Now I'll give you 10 seconds as well. Where would the water be? Well, it'll be about here, right? So you can picture the left tap as the auditory stimulus and the right tap as the visual stimulus, and kind of picture them providing energy or activation at the same time, which basically allows you to reach the initiation of a response in a quicker fashion, okay? And so we are proposing that this co-activation is occurring at the level of response initiation, and I'll elaborate what I mean. And over here, this is the example that I gave earlier about the visual reaction time, and as you can see, it's about 215 milliseconds. Now, imagine if I present an auditory stimulus at 50 milliseconds after the go. What would our reaction time be over here? Well, we know that it takes us 35 milliseconds to identify an auditory stimulus. It takes about 65 milliseconds to get through the initiation process, and about 25 milliseconds for the signal to travel from your brain to your arm. So what's really left is this 50 milliseconds over here, because we're starting at 50 after the go. So this would give us a total of about 175 milliseconds. But that's not what we find. We find even faster reaction times. So we thought, okay, let's look at these slopes and kind of pinpoint where they overlap, which is about over here. So we decided to add up these slopes at the point at which they overlap, and we realized that the slope got steeper. So what does a steeper slope give us? It gave us a faster reaction time. So we thought, what if this is actually happening in these conditions? So we decided to test predictions from all 3 models and decided to compare those predictions to the actual observed reaction times. So this is what we did. We had 12 participants perform a wrist extension to a particular target, so they would just do this, at the go signal, right? So the go signal was either a visual stimulus, an auditory stimulus, or a combination of both the visual and auditory stimulus, where the auditory was presented at 0, 25, 50, 75, 100, or 125 milliseconds after the go. There were 180 trials that were completed, and we collected EMG data from the right extensor carpi radialis longus and the right flexor carpi radialis longus, carpi radialis. And so these are our results, and I'll take a few minutes to talk about them. Now on the y-axis over here, we've got the reaction time, and on the x-axis, we have the different kinds of conditions. Now, as you can see, when the visual stimulus was presented on its own, we had a reaction time of about 215 milliseconds, which is what I previously presented. Now, if you look at the auditory stimulus over here when it was presented on its own, it's also very similar to what I previously said, right? So it's about 115 milliseconds. And now these are the different conditions, and we're going to compare all 3 predictions to the observed reaction times, okay? So these are the horse race model predictions. As you can see, they're very off from the actual observed reaction times. Now, if we move on to statistical facilitation predictions, you can see that they move closer to the observed reaction times, but they're still kind of not quite there. And so the additive initiation predictions, as you can see, are the closest to the observed reaction times, right? And so we tested a goodness of fit test, and we did that to compare the observed data to both the statistical facilitation and the additive initiation models. And as you can see, the predictions of the additive initiation model were not significantly different from the observed reaction times, right? As opposed to statistical facilitation. So this means that we could say with confidence that the additive initiation model is a potential explanation for intersensory facilitation. Now you might think, why is this important, and why do we care about this? Well, not only does it give us an explanation for intersensory facilitation, but it also provides us with an explanation of how the brain can process multiple stimuli at once, which is something that is happening at this very moment. And so to summarize, basically what we're proposing is that perhaps the initiation-related activation of both stimuli are somehow adding up and leading to an overall faster initiation of a response. So to conclude, I'd just like to thank NSERC and the Ministry of Ontario for funding us, and I am more than happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions.
It looked like the beginning anchor of the visual auditory stimuli and the end has more with the statistical facilitation one.
Here?
Yeah, so, and even, so all three models at the very beginning seem to be predicted, and then at the very end they seem to be closer too. Do you think there's something happening at those far ranges?
Well, this is basically where the slopes are not really overlapping. So we don't expect any intersensory facilitation, and therefore we don't expect that the reaction time would be any different than the horse race model would predict, right? So this is where they get different, because this is where the overlap is beginning to happen, right?
And at the far end too?
At the far end as well. Yeah. Yes.
How about just simply paying attention to the auditory stimulus? You know, is that just an easier solution to this particular task?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Is it the easiest solution to this task if you're not just paying attention to the auditory stimulus? So why would I just pay attention to the auditory cue and disregard visual cue because I know this one's going to get a reaction?
I'm not sure I understand, and I can't really hear.
He's just saying why pay attention at all to visual cue? So why not, if you know the auditory cue is coming at some point, then why not?
Even if you tried to not pay attention to the visual cue, you would get a faster reaction time. Because that's what's interesting, because you're gonna get an overall faster reaction time, which doesn't make sense. So you're still processing the visual information even if you're not attending to it.
So how about the work of Allen and Burr on super additive integration? So if you're talking about additive processes, but if you also consider super additive processes, have you looked into that?
No, I haven't looked into that. No.
Maybe David Allen and Burr, B-U-R-R, and A-L-A-I-S. Look into their work.
Okay.
Because you can also predict super activity in the connection of those processes. I think you have a beautiful case. Thank you for your talk.
Okay, thank you.
On that positive note, then we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much.